Okay, hi everyone. So this webinar is going to be on how to cite sources and avoid plagiarism. I'll first introduce myself, then give a brief overview of the webinar, some announcements, and some other tips for the webinar. So my name is Warnke. I will be the director of the Iraq Revolutionary Command Council 1981 at HMUN India. It's one of our specialized agencies committees. At Harvard, I'm a rising senior or fourth year, and I study history and literature, which is basically the humanities, with a focus in the United States, and I also am getting a minor in government. Before I get into the bulk of the substance of this webinar, I want to just tell you a little bit about my philosophy about Model UN. I think Model UN is an opportunity for people from around the world to come together and share ideas. The sharing of ideas is then why it's so important that you understand what plagiarism is and how not to do it. I'll go into a lot of depth about what plagiarism is and how to avoid it, but at its core, plagiarism is stealing someone else's ideas. And for an activity like Model UN, that's why it's so important we understand why not to do it. Throughout the webinar, please feel free to send me questions. You can do so. Sorry, I'm getting some people saying I'm not audible. I'll turn up my volume, but I don't know what else to do to correct that. Anyway, so yeah, throughout the webinar, please feel free to send me questions. You can do so through the chat window. I'll be checking it periodically so that I can answer questions as they arise. Sometimes I might wait to take some of them if I'm in the middle of a subject, but please feel free to send me them whenever you have them, because I will be monitoring the chat. And at the end of the webinar, I'll also open up the floor, so to speak, entirely to questions. You can ask me anything about the webinar or questions about HMUN India then. Great. Glad that I'm now audible. A couple of reminders. I just want to remind you to thoroughly read the background guide. This is the #1, probably most important thing you can do to prepare for conference, so be sure to do it. Then if you have any substantive questions, please email your directors with those. If you have any administrative or logistical questions, please email info@hmunindia.org. And then final reminder that your position papers are due tomorrow, Monday, July 24th. Upload those to Monbase, and information about position papers is in the guide to delegate preparation. And this webinar in particular will help you with some of the aspects of those position papers, namely how to avoid plagiarism and how to cite in your position papers. So, brief overview of what we'll be going over in this. First of all, what is plagiarism? Second, why is it so important not to plagiarize? And finally, how to avoid plagiarizing. Great. Are there any questions at this point about what the webinar will go over? Anything like that? I'll wait a few seconds to make sure nothing pops up in the chat. Okay, great. So first of all, what is plagiarism? So this is from Merriam-Webster's dictionary, and I'm directly quoting here. It is to steal and pass off the ideas or words of another as one's own, or to use another's production without crediting the source. It's also defined as to commit literary theft, to present as new and original an idea or product derived from an existing source. So as you might have noticed, before I quoted from Merriam-Webster dictionary, I announced the source of my material. This is an example of how to reference someone else's work to avoid plagiarizing. So just to give some examples of what it would be to plagiarize, the clearest and most obvious form is when you copy the language from another text and put it directly into whatever you're writing. So let's say you're writing a paper, you look on Wikipedia and you find a great definition of something, or you find a paragraph that explains exactly what you want to be talking about. You copy the whole thing, you paste it into your work, and you pretend it as if you wrote it. That is sort of the core of what plagiarizing is. But, other things that do count as plagiarism, which, you might not expect as much, are if you were, say, to take a sentence, change a few of the words, and then leave it. So if I change a verb from like encourage to promote, but otherwise the sentence looks exactly the same, that also counts as plagiarizing. It's also plagiarism to take from another source and not to cite it. So let's take another example. Let's say you're looking up the number of coal plants in a country. Maybe you're doing research about energy options on your assigned country for HMUN India. And you want to include in your position paper that you think your country should shift from coal-based energy to nuclear energy, right? So you find a great source. It has really specific data and explains how coal is converted to energy really clearly. What should you do with that source? So first of all, you want to find whatever data you think is most relevant, most helpful for you. And then what you'll do is you'll write a sentence that references the data and cite it. What you won't do is copy and paste whatever that sentence was in the original source and put it into your work. But what you might do is say, let's say it says there are 5,000 coal plants. You will use that exact number, put it in your work, in the sentence that you yourself wrote, and then you will, at the end of the sentence, cite it. I'll get into exactly what citing looks like in more detail later, but really the number one important thing is not to copy and paste the sentence exactly as it appears in the source and to cite it. Then again, let's say there's another sentence in your source that really clearly explains how coal is converted into energy. And I'm a humanities person, so I definitely don't understand that process. I couldn't come up with the process on my own. I have a really hard time writing that sentence on my own. So what your other option is then is to take the sentence, do put it directly into your work, but put it in quotes. So quoting basically is saying, yes, someone else wrote this sentence and I'm using it, but they're the one who wrote it. So I'm putting it in quotes and then I'm going to cite it. Are there any questions at this point about what plagiarism is? Okay, well, if there are any throughout, because this really is what is the most important thing to take away from this webinar, please feel free to write them in the chat. I want to just add that, I think, one of the reasons people often plagiarize or run the risk of plagiarizing is that they feel like whoever wrote the source that they're using is an expert on the topic, knows more about the topic than they do, and therefore they feel like, I should just use that person's language. I should just use the sentence that that person wrote. But even if the other person is an expert and you, are just yourself a student, you cannot just use their sentence without citing it. It's great to use the research of other people, to read the work of other people. That's what, research and scholarship is, but you still have to credit the source whenever you use it. So, like I said, you might just be citing some of their data, and that's what you're using. You might be using one of their sentences, but you have to put it in quotes. So I think sort of, here, let me just pause for a second and answer some questions. Okay, so one of our questions is, what if you want to paraphrase a sentence, but if you do, the essence is lost? That's a great question. In general, if you think that if you're afraid you're going to lose the essence of the sentence, what you could do is quote that exact sentence as it came in the source. But what you have to do is quote it. So you put it in quotation marks, and then you put a citation at the end. My next question is, so if you copy, paste your information from a site, yet cite it, will it be counted as plagiarism? So it will be counted as plagiarism if you do not put it directly in quotes. So if you're taking the sentence exactly as it's written from another site, you have to put it in quotes, because quotes are saying like, someone else wrote this, and when I cite it, I'll tell you exactly when and where they wrote this. So yeah, if you copy and paste your information from a site and do not quote it, that is plagiarism. If you copy and paste your information from a site and do quote it, that is not plagiarism. So would using statistics be called plagiarism if you're using the statistics from an official website like a UN website? So no, it's absolutely, a great idea to use statistics from official websites, but you have to cite it. So what you might do is you find a great statistic on a UN website, you include that in your sentence, and then at the end of the sentence, you use a citation to say, oh, and I found it from this website. Don't you also, okay, next question is, don't you also give in-text citations to show where you got the info from? Are in-text citations required if we are already giving our citations in the MLA format at the end of the essay? So these are great questions. These are amazing. I'm going to get into specific citing guidelines toward the end of the webinar. We'll go over when you use in-text citations, when you use footnotes or bibliography. So great. Are there any other questions, though, sort of about what plagiarism is? Great. Okay, well, if you have any more, continue to send them in, and I will either answer them if it's timing appropriate, or I will be sure to answer all of them at the end. Okay, so I also do just want to follow up on a point I was just making, which is like why someone might feel the need to plagiarize. So, or run the risk of plagiarizing. Like the first is, if you think you'd rather be using the language of an expert than your own language. And again, it's great to be referencing and even sometimes using the language of an expert, but you always have to be citing it. So the other thing is I think people often plagiarize when they are running out of time on an assignment. They're really busy, they're really stressed, and even if you have only an hour until a paper is due, I promise you the answer is not to plagiarize. I know of people, I know of friends at school, friends at other schools who have done this and faced really bad consequences, and the answer is it's never worth it. All right, so actually before I go into the next section, I'll just answer a few other questions. Question, is it advisable to use plagiarism detecting sites? I would say when you're writing your own work, you don't need to use a plagiarism detecting site. Just be sure to be careful not to plagiarize. This is something I'll talk about more later, but if you're ever, worried that what you're doing might count as plagiarizing, just be really rigorous about the way you're citing your material, and that's how you avoid it. So let's say you feel like you've taken a sentence and you've paraphrased it too closely to how it showed up in the original source. Maybe you just want to turn that into a quote and take it directly from the original source, quote it, and cite it. Or if you're using a statistic or you're using a piece of information and you're not sure if it's appropriate to cite it or not, just cite it. When in doubt, cite it. And I think that's how you'll know you're avoiding plagiarism, and then you don't need to use a detecting site. So I just want to address something that was mentioned in the chat, which is, so if you copy and paste the exact phrasing, it would be, if you copy and paste the exact phrasing of something, that would be counted as plagiarism. If you paraphrase using statistics, what I would say is paraphrasing can be risky, because if you're paraphrasing too closely to what the original source is, that can still be counted as plagiarism. So you don't want to paraphrase and just change like a word or two. That does not count as you producing your own work. That counts as you tinkering with someone else's work. But if you say, find a statistic, like you find a number, you find the number 50,000, people, and you take that number and you put it into your own work, that is totally appropriate. And then you still want to cite that you found that number from wherever you found it, but you don't need to quote that sentence or anything like that. Great. Okay, I'm going to continue then. So I've talked a little bit about what plagiarism is, but now I want to talk about really why it's important not to plagiarize. A lot of this is obvious, but I think it's helpful just to remind yourself of it, because it's really in those crunch situations when you only have an hour before your paper is due that you start to feel like a plagiarism might be worth it. And these are all reasons why it is definitely not worth it. So fundamentally, plagiarism counts as a form of theft. It can even be illegal. There's what we call intellectual property theft, which is that, someone else's idea is their own, and when you take it and claim that it's your own, that counts as stealing. People get sued over this. People have to pay a lot of money over this. I don't think any of the plagiarism we would be doing as students, writing like a paper or, doing a small project would ever come to this point, but you have to understand that this is the context that plagiarism exists in, where, society takes really seriously that when one person produces something, it belongs to that person, and taking it and passing it off as your own fundamentally counts as theft. So I just want to give some little bit of personal context, which is I really understood the weight of plagiarism best from one of the professors I had my first year at college. She's an academic, so gathering research and writing books, is her profession. It's how she makes money. It's what supports her. And what she told us was that academia, which is, all the fields of scholarship, is fundamentally based on the idea that when someone comes up with an idea or puts pen to paper and writes a sentence, that is their contribution to scholarship. Each person is making commitment to getting at the truth the best way and from the angle they know how. So when my teacher, she focuses on English, writes about this famous author, and she writes a book about it, that is her giving the world her point of view on that author and, her contribution to scholarship. This also counts for, say, when a scientist conducts an experiment and then publishes a paper, or when a historian goes into an archive to research an event and then writes an account of it, even when a psychologist interviews research subjects and claims a finding. So these are all people making a claim that this is the body of work that they have discovered, thought deeply about, and this is their proposal or argument. So that's really how academia works, and all of that falls apart when people start taking ideas from each other and not acknowledging where they came from. Obviously, and for good reason, it's part of everyday life to build off the work of other people, but you have to give credit where credit is due, and plagiarism completely undermines that. Another reason that citing is so important is that even as a student, even at someone at our level of sort of scholarship, is that it allows you to enter a conversation about a topic that already exists. So think about scholars, whether they be scientists trying to discover the function of a particular gene, or historians writing about the Roman Empire, or even model UN delegates coming up with ideas about Iraq in the 1980s. That's all of us being part of a bigger conversation. And what citing and what not plagiarizing allows people to do is to enter that conversation and acknowledge that the work that has come before them and build off of it. So I'm seeing that I'm getting some more questions. I'll answer these in a second, but I just want to finish this section a little bit. I also want to say that on a practical level, plagiarism ruins careers, and it can also ruin your college career. There are a lot of examples of famous historians, famous public figures who were caught plagiarizing. It led to a massive scandal, and it was incredibly embarrassing, and it discredited them for a while. A recent news story that maybe some of you guys also read occurred last summer, when at the Republican National Convention, Melania Trump, who is now the First Lady of the United States, I won't reveal my political opinions about that, but let's just say I'm not too pleased. But anyway, she, at the Republican National Convention, plagiarized a speech that our country's former First Lady, Michelle Obama, had made in 2008 at the Democratic National Convention. And it's important to note exactly what it was that exactly how she was plagiarizing, because it's not that she was, repeating word for word what Michelle Obama had said, but a section of Ms. Trump's speech closely mirrored what Michelle Obama had said, and that too counted as plagiarism. It's a really big embarrassment. It was not a great moment for that campaign by any measure. So anyway, I just want to let you guys know that plagiarism happens in the real world. It happens for historians and scholars. It happens for public figures and public intellectuals, and it's incredibly damaging to a career. On a more relatable level, colleges and universities and high schools take plagiarism extremely seriously. At Harvard, for example, if you're caught plagiarizing, it could just be a few sentences that you lifted from a Wikipedia page. You're sent to our highest disciplinary board. It's called the administrative board. And their standard policy for plagiarism, even if it's a few sentences, is to suspend you for an entire semester, an entire year. And I know of a lot of schools where they might expel you. So those are all reasons not to plagiarize. Then, yeah, I do want to answer questions because I see they're coming through on the chat, which is how does HMUN check for plagiarism and what happens when they find out you plagiarized? Similarly, does HMUN use plagiarizing websites while viewing our position papers? So yes, we do. We will be checking to make sure you are not plagiarizing. And if we find out that you have plagiarized, you are, as someone has written in the chat, not eligible for an award. And yeah, so again, we will be checking for plagiarism. If you plagiarize, you are not eligible for an award. We also will probably take you aside and talk to you about it because we take this extremely seriously. We think it undermines the entire project that we're all here for. So don't do it. Are there any other questions about HMUN's policy about plagiarism or about why it's so important not to plagiarize? Okay, great. So how to avoid plagiarizing? Probably what you really want to know. So how to avoid plagiarizing is to cite your sources. That is really the most important way to do it. If you're trying to use someone else's, if you're trying to, reference someone else's work, if you're trying to quote someone else's work, all of these things you need to cite your sources. So I will now go into a little bit greater detail about what exactly you do need to cite. So first of all, whenever you quote something, so if I had written this presentation down, remember when I cited Merriam-Webster dictionary entry for plagiarism at the beginning? If this were on paper, I would have needed to put quotes around the definition that I used from Merriam-Webster because I was using the words exactly as they appeared on the online Merriam-Webster site. So yeah, whenever you're taking, a sentence, a phrase, words directly from another source, you have to put them in quotes and then cite it. Other things you have to cite are any kind of specific piece of data or fact. So maybe that's the date of a really obscure event. Maybe that's the number of people living in a specific area. Anything like that. In general, if something isn't considered common knowledge, you have to cite it. And a good rule of thumb for trying to, suss out whether something counts as common knowledge or not is if you can't find it in 3 readily accessible sources, it's not common knowledge and you should be citing it. So, readily accessible sources are like things that if you, entered something into a Google search, they would show up on like your first page. If you're going to more obscure sites and something does happen to show up in 3 or more places, it still probably does not count as common knowledge and you should cite it. And in general, and this is really important, always err on the side of oversighting. If you're not sure about whether you should cite something, cite it, because nothing can go wrong if you cite more than if you cite less. Okay, so here we have another question that I want to answer, which is, what if we think we plagiarized in our position paper but have already sent it in? So this is a great question. What you should do is email your director, tell them that you're afraid you plagiarized in the paper and that you want to write a new one and send it in. We will not penalize you if you, on your own, come to us and tell us, before. So do this before your position papers are before the final deadline, July 24th. Tell your director you're afraid you plagiarized something, and then that you're going to write a new one. Again, we won't plagiarize you if you come to us and tell us you're afraid you plagiarized, you don't want to run the risk of doing it, and that you're prepared to write a new position paper. Is that clear? If not, I'll take more questions on that and just be watching the chat. Okay, so then other topics to cite, someone's expressed opinion, maybe it's like, a sort of nuanced opinion about something that you read from a specific author, from a specific expert. And this brings me to another point, which is that citing is in fact like a useful tool for you. It's not just something you're doing to avoid plagiarizing, but what it does is it lets your reader know that you have done thorough research and that you are a credible source. Your reader will want to know that you have done, a good amount of research, that you have read experts and know who those experts are. So citing helps you out. So I got another question, which is, what if you have not plagiarized but just happen to use similar words? So if you use similar words here and there, I wouldn't be too worried about plagiarizing. If you took a sentence and sort of changed a few words around to avoid directly copying, or if you took a couple of phrases from the source and if you took some key phrases from the source, like maybe one or two, maybe they gave some technical language and you use that in your position paper, that is not plagiarism. Like maybe you took a phrase that really only exists and only communicates what it needs to communicate exactly as that phrase does. So I'm thinking of like really technical language, something where, if you were to describe it a different way, it would completely fail to communicate what you're trying to say. But if, let's say, you took a bunch of pieces of sentences or a bunch of phrases and you included them in your position paper, and you sort of just kind of like filled in the space between those, that does count as plagiarism. And I would read over, if you're afraid you've done that, what I would suggest you do is read over your position paper and also look back at the original source. And if they feel really similar, and if it seems like you just change a few words here and there, or that you even relied a lot on that source for key language that shows up a lot in your position paper, I would edit that out, change that. If you've already sent it in, I would email your director and tell them that you'd like to submit a new one. Okay. So now I'm going to go on exactly how to cite. There are a couple of different ways. Different disciplines have different ways. I'm going to walk you through two main ones that I use and that a lot of people tend to use, which are MLA and Chicago. MLA is pretty standard. It's often used in literary disciplines. And the two main things MLA uses are, sorry, I just want to answer a question. Someone asked, please, can you give an example? Sorry, an example of what? If you could just type in the chat. But I'll continue. So MLA is pretty standard. What MLA uses are in-text citations and a works cited page. So what that looks like is that you have a fully sort of written out works cited section at the very end of your paper. Some other citation styles call this a bibliography, but there's a specific way to cite a source depending on that source type. So for books, you put the name of the author, last name first, the name of the book in italics, the name of the publisher, and the publication date. For other different types of sources, you use a slightly different style. So maybe you put like the name of the website or the date it was published, stuff like that. I'm not going to walk through each of those specifically just because it won't be useful. You won't be able to retain that information, but I will give you suggestions about how to find it later. So that's what you do for your works cited. It's like a very full thing at the end of your paper. And you give full descriptions of every single source you use depending on the style that MLA dictates, which you can find online. Then in the text, you will do what are called parenthetical citations, which means that at the end of the sentence, you put in parentheses the name of the author and usually like the page number or a specific piece in the article where you found it. Then there are other types of there are other systems used to cite. Another big one is Chicago style, And this one, you have a bibliography at the end. It's like the MLA work cited page in that, it's a full entry about each word you used. But then for Chicago, what's different is you use footnotes or endnotes, depending on your preference. And what those look like is that you have a sentence. At the end of the sentence, there'll be a little number that you put, and then it'll link you to somewhere, either if it's a footnote at the bottom of the page or at the end note at the end of the piece, at the end of the work, where you give a small citation of where you found it. And it depends on the source what information exactly you'll be putting in. So if it's a website, you'll put the source site, the date it was published, the date you accessed it, and the URL. If it's a book, you'll, like an MLA, put the name of the author and the page number. And then a really useful thing that you can use when you're citing is, and this exists only when you're using footnotes and endnotes, is you can put what's called IBID, I-B-I-D. It's this word that basically means that the source that you're citing in that moment is the same as the previous one. So I'm seeing that there are some more questions. And yeah, I will get on to great sites to use for citing, as people are putting on the chat now. But I want to answer one of the questions, which is, in my position paper, I paraphrased the solutions mentioned but didn't cite it. Will this be counted as plagiarism? So if you I'm not sure where you paraphrase the solutions mentioned from in this case, but if you paraphrase it from the background guide, you still want to be citing the background guide. Again, paraphrasing, it's tricky sometimes to know when you are paraphrasing too closely and therefore running the risk of plagiarizing, and when you are just sort of like, using the information that you found in a source. But what I would say is if you're at all concerned, just cite it, and that way you don't have to be concerned. And if you paraphrase the solutions mentioned from like an online source or a book you read, also just cite it. Exactly, yeah. If you just change a few words, that still counts as plagiarism. And you have to be, what you should do if you're afraid you just changed a few words and what you've done is counted as plagiarism, what I would say is either go back and just directly quote from the source, put it in quotes, and put a citation, or completely change the sentence, make it so that you're not borrowing the language from another source. And if you've done this in a position paper and you've already submitted the position paper, email your director, tell them you're afraid you plagiarized and you want to write a new paper and that you'll send it in tomorrow. Next question is, do we also have to use in-text citations even for videos if we use them as sources? So that's a great question. Yeah, you're not always going to be citing just from a text. You might be citing from a photo, you might be citing from a video, and you do still need to cite them. So it's up to you whether you use in-text citations or whether you use like a footnote or an endnote. But you still have to cite it. Again, there's specific formats about what you do for a video, like you often have to put the title and then you put a timestamp. And you can do this either in text or at footnotes or endnotes, but yes, you do need to cite a video. You need to cite any source, even if it's not text-based. Okay, so I'm seeing now that someone's saying that they had paraphrased solutions mentioned from an NGO's website, and that's what they use in their position paper. So yes, you do need to cite that NGO's website. If you are paraphrasing from a website, you have to cite it. If you're taking from the background guide, you do have to cite it. I'm seeing another question here that reads, just so everyone who watches this later knows, is, so if we take text from the background guide, we still cite it. And yes, if you're copying and pasting from the background guide, you have to cite the background guide. If you're very closely paraphrasing the background guide, you have to cite the background guide. If you're using data or statistics from the background guide, you have to cite the background guide. If you're using general knowledge that you gathered from the background guide, like maybe the background guide told you that, the date of something, or maybe it told you, sort of like Iraq's economy is based on oil, something that my background guide would tell you if you read it. You don't have to cite that because that's very sort of like a general comment, it's general knowledge, something you could find in a lot of sources. And you don't have to say, like, as I read in your background guide, Iraq's economy relies on oil. But if you are, using a direct sentence that you found in the background guide, you have to cite it. Okay, I'm seeing a question that says, will the adoption of existing ideas be counted as plagiarism? Sorry, could you just, for the person who asked that question, could you just clarify what you mean by that? Is like existing ideas that you found somewhere in particular or something like that? That would be helpful. In the meantime, I'm going to go on to where you can find useful things for citing, some online guides, online citation generators, things like that. Okay, so I personally don't use citation generators just because I'm bad at using them, but I do highly recommend them anyway. So a straightforward one, as someone mentioned, I believe on the chat, is called EasyBib. That's EASYBIB. It's just like an online website. What you do is, depending on the source, you can either put the URL where you got it and the format you want it to be in. So EasyBib will let you generate a citation in MLA, in Chicago, in APA, in other citation formats. You just tell them like which citation format you want them to use. You put the URL where you got the source from, and it'll generate the citation for you. For sources that don't have a URL, so maybe a book, maybe a photograph, what you do is you manually enter some of the information, and they'll ask for the specific information that's required, and then they'll generate the citation for you in the proper format. And it's really useful because, different citation styles require different things. They ask you to put certain things in italics. They ask you to put certain information in certain places, and it's really confusing to sometimes do that on your own. So EasyBib is a great one because if you manually input the relevant information, or if you link it to a URL, it'll generate it for you in the proper format. Another great citation tool that's slightly more advanced, but that is an amazing one, it's actually the only one I will use if I'm using an online one, is called Zotero. That's spelled Zotero. And why Zotero is really great is that it's actually really helpful for you as you're doing the research, because it'll let you store a source and like the information about a source in Zotero. And then what you'll do is, as you're writing your paper, let's say you used a certain book, you've stored it in Zotero, you've put all the relevant information in, and then you want to, for a citation, you want to reference a specific page that you used for that specific piece of information. You can use Zotero to generate that specific citation, and then you can also use it to generate multiple citations. So it's kind of like you just say, here's this source, and I want to put it in my paper, in my footnotes at multiple points. Zotero is really helpful for letting you do that. And it also, what's even more helpful is to let you store many, many sources at once. So you'll have like a running list of all the sources you've used. And, just at any point, you can, press the special function, and it will let you generate a citation from it. And if you get like a desktop or a downloadable version of Zotero, what you can do is you can link it to whatever platform you use to write, your work. So like, let's say you use Microsoft Word, it'll let you export citation from Zotero to Microsoft Word. And that way you can just have like a running list of your sources, and you're very easily able to put it into your work. Okay, so I'm gonna answer some questions. So a question is, when using online sources, the source tells us when the source was last updated. Is that considered as the electronic publication time? So yeah, this is, a very specific question. It sort of depends on the type of information, I would say. So if it's something where, sometimes you'll get websites that'll give you kind of like a running update about a certain group or about a certain piece of information. And if that's the case, I would date it from the time it was last updated. So I'm thinking, for example, of like, this is actually a great resource for a lot of multi-event things. If you go on the Council on Foreign Relations website, they'll have like monitors of global conflicts. And that's the type of thing where you want to be citing the most recent updated timestamp, because the whole point of that type of resource is that they're giving you up-to-date information about something. But then sometimes you'll have sources where they've changed the date because they made like a really small edit. So for this, I'm thinking of something like a New York Times article, where sometimes they'll like misquote something or they misrepresent something, and they'll go back and change a few words. And often at the end of their articles, they'll put like updated this date because we changed this. If that's the case, no, you still want to be citing from the original date, because that's really like the true publication date, and whatever edit they made doesn't, it wasn't, they were writing the bulk of the piece at the time when they put the original timestamp. That's what you want to be using. So just think about what kind of source it is, and if it's the type of source where it's constantly being updated and that's the point of the source, use the most recent date. If it's the type of source where really it was a one-time source and they happened to have to go back and make an edit, then I would still use the original date. Because you just want to be sort of as, like, sometimes it's hard to decide what exactly you're doing, but you just want to try to be as true to what the source was trying to do as possible. And that type of thing where if you put the wrong date, it's not a big deal. You always want to be as accurate as possible when you're citing, but everyone makes small mistakes about stuff like that, and I wouldn't worry too much about that type of thing. Just try to be sure you're, citing whenever you think it's absolutely necessary to cite, and being sort of as careful as possible in the citations you're using. So I just went over two pretty good online citing sources. There's EasyBib. It's definitely one I'd recommend. There's Zotero, slightly more advanced. Also highly recommend. If you want to use either of these, which I definitely recommend you do, what I would encourage you to do, after this or next time you're writing something, or, for your position paper, is Google around and find an online citation tool that really works for you. And figure out exactly how to use that citation source. I'm not going to walk through sources specifically, just because it's the type of thing where you really have to do it to understand it, and it won't be that helpful if I walk through it, because you'll want to be doing it based on whatever specifically you need. But what I would recommend is that you find something now, you find something soon that works for you, and then just get into the rhythm of using it. That way, citing will become a really easy part of writing papers or of doing whatever work you have to do, and it won't feel like a burden. So if you find a system that works for you, figure it out soon, and you can use it for the rest of your life. What I'd also say is there are also online guides to citing, which are ones that'll give you examples of how to cite certain sources. Some really great ones are, there's a thing called Chicago Turabian, if you want to Google that. Purdue, Purdue, it's university, had some pretty good guides. And these will just give you clear examples of how to cite specific sources, and you can just from those infer what you need to do for the specific source you're using. I actually do tend to do it that way. I tend to look up examples online and then manually do it for myself, just because I'm not a very tech-savvy person. But for those of you who are more tech-savvy, I really recommend using an online citation generator, something like EasyBib or Zotero, and there are also others. for this conference, what you should be doing and what you should be doing for your position papers is pick one of the standard forms. Maybe that's MLA, maybe that's Chicago. There's also, Harvard has a system that a lot of people use. There's something called APA. Use that system and just, stick with it for your position paper. Then when you get to conference, I would encourage you to ask your director how he or she would like you to cite. Your director at conference will help you, with specific citation formats and go over plagiarism again. But for your position papers, which are due tomorrow, just pick a common system and really stick to it. Okay, so I just want to give some main points about the webinar, and then I'll just open this up entirely to questions, and I'll take your questions for the remainder of the webinar. So just your main points are: cite information. When in doubt, cite. It's always better to oversight than it is to undercite. Never copy a sentence without quoting it. Don't just sort of closely paraphrase something. If you are too closely paraphrasing something, that counts as plagiarism, and if you're not sure if what you're doing is plagiarism, assume it is. Either quote the sentence, rewrite the sentence, and always cite your source. And then finally, find a citation tool that works for you and learn it well, and it'll be a lifesaver. Okay, so now I'm going to answer some more questions, which is, one of them is, if your work is not online, how do you make citations? So let's say you're using a book, for example, something that's not online. What you can do is you can go to EasyBib, and they'll ask you specifically so you can put in EasyBib that you want to be citing a book, and then they'll ask you, okay, what's the title of the book? And you'll write that in. What's the author of the book? And you'll write that in. Who's the publisher of the book? You'll write that in. And then you'll press, generate citation, and it'll make the citation for you with all the proper format. So like last name first, or like this book will be in italics, or like this word will be in quotes. And it'll make it sort of, exactly the proper format. But you will have to manually enter the information if it's not online. Do we use MLA 8? So you can use MLA 8. Try to use whatever the most recent version is. I think you're right that it's probably 8th edition at this point. But if you're using a previous edition, that's not a big deal. What you should do is just be consistent with whatever sort of source with whatever way you're citing. So don't use MLA for something, Chicago for others. In one work, in one paper, use the exact same system. So, what that's going to mean is that if you're using Intext citations, which is like something where you'd have where you'd have parentheses, and then you'd have like usually the author of the work, and then, some sort of sign of where in the work you found it. You don't also have footnotes if you're doing it that system. So you're either doing in-text citations or you're doing footnotes. But yeah, you can use MLA 8 or you can use something else. For books, you can use the ISBN number. I think that is correct. Sometimes, though, you might just want to manually enter the information because there might be different editions of a book, or, what you can also do is go onto EasyBib or go into another online citation generator and put in the information, and if it spits something out that doesn't look right, just redo it or do it manually. And a great way to figure out if it looks right or if it doesn't is to go online, look up sort of a straight style guide. So again, those can be found if you just Google like MLA Style Guide, or if you specifically Google, there's a great one from Purdue, that's one I tend to use, and it'll give you a breakdown based on the source type. And from there you can figure out, okay, well, EasyBib gave me this thing, but it seems like they're putting the author's name somewhere else, or like they found the different author's name, and then you should just, manually change it. Okay, next question. Do we do a works cited page if we do in-text citations? Yes, you do. So even if you're doing when you're doing in-text citations, you still want to works cited at the end, which is basically a bibliography. Different formats just use different names to describe what a bibliography is, but that's what a works cited is. Next question. So yes, if you use a works cited, you do use a works cited page if you're doing index citations. While citing a PDF or book, is it necessary to mention the page numbers from which we got the information? Yes, it is necessary. When you're citing, a long document, whether it's a PDF or a book, you want to put page numbers. And as someone in the chat is pointing out, yes, in EasyBib you can usually, depending on the source type, they'll ask you for a page number. And you can put it in and it will generate the citation with the page number. Are there any other questions? I will stick around for as long as people have questions. Do we have to mention the date accessed while citing? Yes, usually you will have to. It depends again on the source type. If it's something like a book, no, you don't. But if it's a website, yes. And different formats have different sort of instructions about how you do that. Often it'll look like something where you either put date accessed and then the date, or it'll look like something where you put web, W-E-B, period, and then you put the date. But again, different style guides have different systems. Okay, so next question reads, when you are quoting a famous celebrity, do you have to cite that or just say the name of the person? So what you'll want to do in this scenario is you'll probably want it within the text of your position paper or whatever you're writing is say like, as so-and-so said, and then, put it in quotes. But then you still have to tell your reader where you found that quote. So even though the famous person said it, it's unlikely that you were there to actually hear them say it. So you'll have to tell your reader, and yes, I found this from, Encyclopedia Britannica, which was quoting that famous person. Or I found this from this New York Times article, which produced the quote of that person. So yes, you'll have to cite where you found the source, and you'll have to say the name of the person who said it. Are there any other questions? Okay, we have a great question here, which is, do we have to give references to sources while giving speeches? So if you're directly quoting from something, yes, you have to reference that source. If you're citing data, it's helpful. So then if you're directly quoting, you have to reference the source. In general, I'd say it's helpful to reference the source. It'll also bolster your argument. If you're able to say, and I found this from the Office of the High Commissioner for Refugees of the United Nations, like that'll give whatever you're saying more credibility. So especially if you're citing data or like specific statistics, you'll probably want to reference the source so people know where exactly you found that and that you didn't make the number up. In general, though, you don't have to be as rigorous about referencing your sources when you're speaking. because, odds are you're not going to be taking something directly from another source when you're speaking extemporaneously. But if you are directly quoting, yes, reference the source. And if you're citing specific facts, yes, reference the source. And yeah, I just want to reiterate HMUN India's policies on plagiarism, just so they're fresh in your heads as you go off, which is we have an absolutely zero tolerance policy for plagiarism. If you're caught plagiarizing, you will not be eligible for an award. This counts for your position papers. This counts for your working papers. This counts for your resolution drafts. This counts for your resolutions. This counts for directives. This counts for crisis notes. This counts for any written document you might be submitting at HMUN India, all the way from the position paper to the final piece of paper you send in at the end of the weekend. And the bottom line is plagiarizing is never worth it. It has terrible consequences, and depending on where you do it, when you do it, it could even ruin your career. And even if time is of the essence, ask for an extension. Tell your director you need an extension on the position paper if this is something you're worried about specifically for the position paper. In life, tell your professors, tell your teachers you need an extension if it's something you're worried about for schoolwork. Bottom line, though, is every option is better than plagiarizing. All right, are there any other questions? Okay then, if there are no other questions, I'm going to conclude this webinar. Thank you to all of those who watched it live. If you have questions about it and you're watching it recorded, please feel free to email me at my HMUN India email, which is iraq, IRAQ, at hmunindia.org. And actually, let me double check that that's my email address for this conference. I don't want to give you the wrong one. Yeah, exactly. Iraq at hmunindia.org. And yeah, if you have any questions now or later, please feel free to email me there. I look forward to seeing you all, especially those of you who are in my committee at HMUN India. And final suggestion is if you're worried that you plagiarized in your position paper, email your director now as soon as you can, and let them know and ask to submit a new position paper. And yeah, thank you so much for taking the time to watch, and have a good evening.